Understanding and Embracing African American Vernacular English. Admittedly, during my first year of teaching, I adopted an age old practice that emulated my colleagues. I endeavored to make every attempt to standardize the language of my black students. Now, certainly, as educators, we have a duty to prepare our students for college and career possibilities. And one way we do that is by ensuring students possess the requisite speaking skills for conveying lucid, grammatically correct thoughts. What I did, however, was tantamount to educational malpractice. I would sit passively and watch my colleagues belittle black students by saying things such as, "No, you don't use that language here. Use that language in the streets. Here we speak properly." Admonishments such as this served as a model for me. Unfortunately, these admonishments also became a refrain for me. I will never forget one particular exchange with a well intentioned colleague who confided the following: "You know, if we don't help them, they will never learn how to speak English correctly. Their parents don't know how to speak well, so where else will they learn if we don't force them to speak the right way?" My colleague continued, "Don't let them use words like ain't, yeah, and I'd." I remember that statement vividly, as it was the day after Halloween during my first year of teaching. I was struck by that statement. I took it to heart. In fact, I became as much of a staunch proponent of proper speech for students as that colleague, especially for my black students, who, my colleague intimated, needed to be saved more so than the other students. For the next couple of years, I disallowed the use of certain words in my classroom. I even had a bank of forbidden words taped to my whiteboard for constant reference, complete with words such as ain't, I'd, yeah, and probably, in analog for probably. This word bank represented an attempt to constrain student expression under the auspices of education. Fastidious to a fault, I would correct every verbal solecism on the part of my students. I would stop them mid sentence to prevent the word ain't from escaping their lips, or I would ask them to restate an entire sentence, paragraph, or stanza if a verboten word was either used in speech or writing. In retrospect, I was far more destructive than helpful. In fact, an analysis of my colleagues' earlier words and the actions taken in my classroom represent a linguistically imperialist mindset that makes me shudder. When I reflect on her words, "if we don't force them to speak the right way," I bristle. In this context, the word force evokes images of people being stripped of their native inclinations in favor of practices someone else deems more pragmatic or productive. Regretfully, practices of this kind are spread throughout the annals of history and leave people feeling aimless and discomfited. Thankfully, I decided to adopt an alternative ideology concerning language use in my classroom. Instead of chiding those who used double negatives in sentences, for example, I began to embrace the speech patterns as distinctive and culturally pertinent to those using the language. For me, the change came as a result of consultation with a sagacious, well meaning colleague who challenged my thinking in a manner that proved cathartic. Simply, my colleague asked, "Why do you do that?" With that query, I was forced to defend my fossilized practice of forcing students into a linguistic box. With each offer of evidence, my colleague parried the explanation and demanded stronger justification. Despite each impassioned effort at absolution, my colleague would not let me off the hook. I was forced to reconcile my reality with the new information confronting me. Very shortly after this conversation, I resolved to learn more about the speech patterns of many black Americans. Although my research is ongoing, my learning to this point changed the way I interacted with my students and presumably increased the self efficacy of the students I have since encountered.